Hi, my name's Noah Shachtman. I'm a non-resident fellow at Brookings, and as of 2 days ago, an editor at Foreign Policy magazine. And we are going to talk about bugs, bytes, and bots, basically the future of the security environment. I could give one of those long standard talks you hear at every security conference about the future of warfare and, you know, the internet's really important and, hey, have you heard about these things called drones? But instead, I thought I'd just let like 3 of the smartest people I know talk instead. Why don't we do that? And so first I've got Irv here, Irving Lachow, who has been working on cybersecurity professionally for 15 years. I know here in Washington, a lot of people think like the internet was invented a couple of years ago, but Irv's been working on it for a really long time. He's one of the smartest guys I know on it. Ben not only has the awesomest beard here at the conference.
That's my primary qualification.
Yeah, I don't. But it has been leading some of the most interesting war games about the future of technology and the future of the security environment for the Noetic Corporation, and is a non-resident fellow here at CNAS. And finally, on my far left, the woman who needs no introduction, professor of Georgetown Law, former counselor to Michelle Flournoy, and a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine, Rosa Brooks.
No, I don't think I'm actually on your far left, just on your left. I like to think
right. On some issues, perhaps, yeah.
Someone's got to be there.
We're here all week, folks.
We didn't think anyone could get to the left of Noah, but yeah.
And so I thought I'd start by asking each of these very smart people a very hard question about a very disruptive technology. And so, Irv, I'm going to start with you. I don't know if you heard, but in the news, there have been these revelations about the National Security Agency conducting some. Oh, I guess they've heard about it too. So, you know, the sort of intellectual construct behind the program, I don't quite get, because we're talking about searching for a very, very, very few number of people by conducting surveillance in some way, maybe in a very modest, you know, just some metadata, maybe even less, on kind of everybody. And so is that construct that we've been sort of engaged in for the last 10 years, is that a construct that makes sense? Is it one that's effective? And is it one that works going forward for the next 10 years?
Great question. So in true policy wonk fashion, I'll answer with yes and no. Mm-hmm. Which gives me, you know, a lot of time to get into my answer. I won't take too long. So the yes is, I think it actually can be very effective. So if you look at where the commercial sector is going with data mining and data analytics, big data, I'm sure you've all heard of it, it's incredible what can be done. And many of us probably have no idea how much companies know about us just from surfing the internet. So when you show up at a website, just by looking at the cookies that are on your machine, they know what sex you are, they probably know roughly how old you are, they probably know where you live, how much money you make, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, all that information is out there, and that's just cookies on your browser. So by looking at all this data, the metadata, so not the content, but just the patterns of behavior, you can actually, I think, do a fairly good job of at least finding some interesting patterns. So in that sense, the yes is, actually, the more data you have, in some ways, the better you can do, the more variables you have. I mean, this is Google's whole approach, Google Analytics. I mean, the more data, the more variables they have about you, the better they can target you with ads and the like. So in that sense, I think it can be very effective. The no is that my guess is you need to combine that approach with other forms of intelligence, right? The other ints. And law enforcement activity to try to then find out if this interesting situation is one that needs to be looked at further. And so that's where I think we need to bring in other techniques to try to understand what's actually going on there. The other issue, the other part of the no is the fact that there are trade-offs with all this, right? So it's, I think, fairly obvious that we're giving up, or potentially giving up, liberty for security, right? That's sort of the fundamental debate that I think is showing up in the news now. Well, I think there's some other fundamental issues at play having to do with how these systems actually work, and questions about oversight, about data retention, about how information that's gathered could potentially be used later on, which was a big issue with the CISPA legislation. And let me just highlight that with an example to show why I think this is an important issue. So there are roughly 4 million people in this country that have a security clearance. And if you look at surveys that are found in, whatever, People Magazine and Us Magazine and all that, they'll tell you that roughly 15% of married people have an affair. So if we assume that half the people that have clearances are married, then we can assume that, say, roughly 300,000 people who have clearances are having or have had an affair. So the question is that a national security risk? And many people would tell you that it could be, right? Because if you have an affair, you're potentially open to blackmail. You might end up in some financial difficulty. You might become emotionally unstable. I mean, who knows, right? But the point is there's potentially some risk there. So what if by looking at this metadata, you could actually predict who is having an affair? And this is not that far-fetched, because you can Google stories about people using iPhone apps to catch their spouse having an affair. So one could imagine the NSA being able to do this pretty effectively. So what if someone in the government says, you know what, I'm really worried about this issue because potentially this is a counterintelligence risk. So we're going to start looking at this metadata and analyzing the metadata of people who have clearances and try to see who's had an affair to help protect our national security. Should we be allowed to do that? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think there needs to be a debate about those kinds of issues. I don't think decisions like that should be made behind the green door. I think there needs to be some discussion about questions like that, and so that's where I think there's a serious trade-off. And let me just close with one final point, which is that I think in looking at these technologies, and maybe all the technologies, I know Noah, Ben has talked about this in some of his noetic work, is I think in looking at where these technologies are taking us, we need to look at 4 questions. So is something that we're doing legal? Is it ethical? Because the ethics question is very different from the legal question, and sometimes very interesting. Is it effective, which you asked? And is it wise? Because sometimes I think we can do things that are perfectly legal and may be ethical, and they may be incredibly effective, but in the long run, they may actually be unwise, and I think that's something we need to bring to the table.
Okay, thanks, Irv. I did not expect this conversation to go into marital infidelity. Thanks for taking us into. Ben, I'm going to get to you in a second, but since you brought up the legal and ethical questions, Rosa, I want to jump to you. And the president, in his speech defending the use of drones, recently sort of couched things in our argument of effectiveness, in an argument of legality, and maybe a little ethics in there, maybe. And so I wondered, are those even the right ways to capture something like drones, or is there some other construct we should be using?
I think the same issue is going to be true across all of the different things we're talking about, whether we're talking about NSA surveillance technologies, or I think Ben may talk a little bit about 3D printing or drone strikes. I actually think that the question, is it legal, is not a particularly useful question to ask. And I think, and I hesitate
and
to say that.
You are a law professor.
I'm a law professor, right. It's a really stupid question, and it doesn't have an answer, essentially. We're at a moment where we literally, the law is almost indeterminate. It's almost useless. We can ask until we are blue in the face whether or not this stuff is legal, and we will keep coming up with useless answers. And here's why. I mean, go back a little bit in time to right after the 9/11 attacks. And we were faced with this thing which we didn't recognize, and it looked a little bit like war, right? I mean, it was killed thousands of people. It looked a little bit like crime. It didn't involve states. It didn't involve traditional weapons. It didn't involve a traditional battlefield. We had to decide, what are we going to call this thing? And what kinds of tools are going to we use to combat it? And I think we had a choice, among other things. We had a choice of legal frameworks. We could decide we could call it a terrible crime. We could decide we could call it an attack, but not one that was going to lead us into an armed conflict, a war, but would instead trigger a sort of international law right of self-defense, but not start a war. Or we could decide to call it a war. And for a lot of complicated reasons, we decided we were going to call it a war. And that triggers the law of armed conflict, which is this very specific legal framework with a set of rules about when and against whom you can use force that's totally different from any of the other legal frameworks we might have chosen. And then what happened is once we were in that world, we'd chosen the war legal framework. That framework begins to drive our strategy, frankly. And the trouble with that legal framework is it doesn't actually answer any of the interesting questions. And here's the thing, right? Our law of armed conflict dates from essentially the end of World War II, when we thought we knew what a soldier was, we knew what a battlefield was, we knew what a weapon was. They were reasonably clear except on the margins. And that's just not the case anymore with the kinds of things that we're looking at right now. I don't think we really know any longer. What's a soldier? Or to put it in the language of the law, what's a combatant? What's the battlefield? What's the geographic scope in which the law of armed conflict with its very permissive set of rules about the use of force applies? Well, we don't really know. All of these, what's a weapon? I mean, is cyber a weapon? Is a line of code is a weapon? Well, it can kill people, potentially. It can cause real damage. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the result of all of this is that we have this series of questions we can't really answer because we've got a legal framework designed for a very, very different set of realities. And once you're in that law of war paradigm, there's basically no principled place to draw any lines at all anymore. Because here's the deal, right? If al-Qaeda members are combatants when they're in Afghanistan, it seems perfectly reasonable to say that they're still combatants and thus still targetable, et cetera, when they're in Pakistan or Yemen or anywhere else, or Detroit or Bosnia or Nigeria. If you can detain people you capture in Afghanistan indefinitely under the law of war, it seems perfectly reasonable to say you can detain people you get in Bosnia or Pakistan or anywhere else. If you can go after al-Qaeda, of course you can go after its co-belligerents. That's always been true under the law of war. If you can go after Germany and Bulgaria comes to the aid of Germany, you can go after Bulgaria. But the problem here is that from each of these reasonably clear legal assertions, it's not a very big stretch to the next. But eventually you just have this set of syllogisms that is so extended that you would never have recognized the conclusion at the outset. And I think that's been very characteristic of the debate about the 2001 AUMF, for instance, that you just get this endless series of syllogism in which at the end of the day you have this seemingly restrictive grant of authority that turns out not to be even remotely restrictive. So what do we do about that? I'm not quite sure what we do about it, but what I do think it certainly has the implication that asking the question, well, are drone strikes legal, or is NSA surveillance legal, or this or that? It's just a meaningless question. I can make just as powerful a legal argument to say that drone strikes are perfectly lawful under the law of armed conflict. They're lawful strikes against lawful targets. And I can make just as compelling an argument to say that they're extrajudicial executions. And there's no basis. There's really no basis on which you can say that one is right and the other is wrong, because we're just taking two completely different legal frameworks and we don't have any basis for choosing which one to apply. I think that, so we're Americans, right? We all love the law, so we all have a tendency to start off every debate by saying, well, what would it be legal for me to do? And then the problem is that when the answer is, heck, anything, then we say, well, I guess we'll do everything, right? And I think, frankly, that's been part of what has characterized our so-called strategy in the last 10 years, is that because we can lawfully do almost anything, we do lawfully do almost anything, and we have not been doing a very good job at answering that other set of questions that Irv raised, which is, maybe it's lawful, but so what? That doesn't mean it's ethical. It doesn't mean it's wise. It doesn't mean it's strategically effective in the long term. And I think we're only just beginning to have that discussion. And I actually, to give President Obama credit here, I actually thought that he himself acknowledged that as an issue. He didn't offer any answers. He didn't offer to change anything in particular. But I think he certainly said, legality is not the same as wisdom. And now is a really good moment for us with Afghanistan winding down, et cetera, for us to start saying, A, what is smart? What are we trying to achieve? And what is a smart way to achieve it, regardless of what is lawful or what we can argue is lawful? And B, the deeper question, in some ways, the even harder question is, if we have a set of legal norms and institutions that were designed for an era that doesn't exist anymore, gosh, can we even begin to imagine what is that project of creating a set of new legal categories and institutions that in this 21st century world with these very different technologies that the framers of the Geneva Conventions, for instance, never imagined, can we begin to get some new norms institutions that protect human dignity and protect our security at the same time? And what would they look like? I don't think we have any idea.
Well, I think in addition to that, it's a trend that we're going to see continue because the technology is moving faster than our legal frameworks and our ethical frameworks, and faster than we can have that discussion, and certainly faster than we can get any consensus. So as it continues to play out, we can't just figure out like, what are all the laws for drones? What are all the laws for cyber? Right. It's going to keep coming. I mean, when we get into bio stuff, it gets even worse. And so in addition to being able to come up with a decision, even if it's just the decision of the day, how do we track that over time? Because I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing around both drones and in the cyber domain is a lack of trust from the American people in the decisions that are being taken. If they actually understood everything that was happening, they may agree, but they just don't feel good about it because they don't understand either. So how do we move that debate forward? How do we do it publicly and establish trust in the same way that we've done for weapons and technologies in the past?
Speaking of which, Ben, I want you to just talk for a couple minutes about what I think, is one of the most exciting and totally freaking scary sets of technologies out there, which is additive manufacturing. I think there's been a lot of talk about 3D printing, and people think it's like, oh, I can make a toy for my kid, or I can make a gun that fires 2 bullets and then falls apart.
22 caliber rounds, no less, yes.
And so neither of those seem particularly like a big deal, but I'm hoping you can just explain a little bit about additive manufacturing and why it is in fact a big deal, and in what way is it a big deal?
Sure. So when we talk about additive manufacturing, that's the old, 30-year-old term for what's now being called 3D printing. It's still similar technology, it's just advanced. The quick thing here for a 3D printer is it's similar to an inkjet printer, except it operates on 3 axes and can build up through spraying nozzles or extrusion or a number of different technologies, a 3-dimensional model. When we wargamed this recently, it was interesting. Everyone came in very excited. There's a lot of talk, a 3D printer can almost print a 3D printer. It's so meta. Like, what are we going to do? But that's not actually, from a military perspective, that's not necessarily exciting. So we had all of these military professionals coming in, looking at this from a blue perspective and a red perspective, ready to change the world with 3D printing. And then it got into sort of combat-oriented scenarios, and they couldn't use it quite as much. And then they lost interest and started thinking about robot swarms.
Like you do.
When you've got so many tools available to you. Yeah. The thing for me is that additive manufacturing is an enabler, and we need to think of it as an enabling technology, not an effects-generating technology. And really what it allows us to do is to separate design and manufacturing and really simplify and speed up the manufacturing process. So we have a lot more agility in the way that we manufacture, and in some ways we're looking at additive manufacturing as sort of open hardware in the same way that we saw open source software. So additive manufacturing, as Chris Anderson says, Chris Anderson, formerly of Wired magazine, it really allows us to separate out the design from the technology and democratize that entire process. So what does that mean in terms of technology and why it's useful for military professionals? I think about it in 2 main areas. One is adaptation, and the other is proliferation or distribution. It's distribution if we're doing it, it's proliferation if other people are doing it. So
that's good.
Adaptation, if we look at some examples of adaptation, we've actually seen the Army is already doing this. The Rapid Equipping Force has been deploying mobile labs where they're putting out 3D printers, laser cutters, a number of other things that they've deployed in mobile labs to Afghanistan, which allow people, they'll forward deploy a couple of scientists or engineers and manufacture small parts, whether that's, how do we connect a ground penetrating radar to an MRAP? You can do that quickly and tactically and respond. Now, our adversaries can do this as well. They've actually been doing it and did it quite effectively, taking the eye out of IED in Iraq, but not using 3D manufacturing technology. So I think that we can see some short-term things there, which are kind of interesting. And again, whether the technology allows us to do that is that we don't need to go back and retool things. We don't need to take large production facilities forward. We've got a lot more adaptability there. I think in the longer term, if we play this out at the industrial level, we can talk about new ways of doing manufacturing. Essentially, we can move at the speed of prototyping, but for production level stuff. Now, the economics doesn't work out, which when we get back to the 3D printed rifle, that's not especially exciting to me because it's always going to be easier to buy 1,000 M16s than to try to print them. The numbers just work that way. But what we need to think about is things that work in small batches. And for me, this is where 3D printing or additive manufacturing is really powerful. Small batches of high-value enabling technologies. So that means that we wouldn't necessarily need to build 500 MRAPs. Why don't we print a smaller number of them, deploy them, and then allow the enemy to become part of the testing process? So we don't have to go through these, like, it's going to take us 20 years to build this, but we'll have 1 million of them. I don't want to wait 20 years, and I don't want 1 million of those things. I want it now, and I want it to change over time. When I think about the proliferation thing, there's some shorter term stuff that we can see. As we were wargaming some of this stuff, and I've participated in some of these games, we saw the opportunity for the adversary to do expeditionary terrorism. You don't have to take anything, you just got all the designs. As long as you can get access to a printer and the right materials, you can print a bunch of stuff out. What
does that mean? Can you give me an example of
what does that mean?
Yeah.
So you could print a drone. You'd have to buy a motor separately, but you can print a number of the technologies that you would use. The one that concerned me the most as we were talking through all of this, and thankfully it was someone who does science and technology intelligence in DoD who came up with this, is thinking about this as an enabler, is printing parts for a centrifuge. So when we think about proliferation, we have laws, we have ways of dealing with centrifuges, we have ways that we can interdict supplies of that stuff. If we can't see that anymore, if all we can see is certain materials moving to a different country, that's much harder to track. Before we start freaking out, there are a number of things that we can't quite do with the technology yet. There are a number of materials that we can't print. We can't print multiple materials at the same time. And there's always going to be challenges about size. So I think that there are a number of things that come out, but really thinking about it as I said, things that allow us to be more adaptable, things dealing with proliferation or distribution, and looking at anything that is going to be needed in small quantities but is high value, is really where I see it going.
Okay, 3D printed centrifuges. That seems totally terrifying.
It'll be fun.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
I'm going to open things up to the audience in just 1 second, so get your questions ready. I see there's this guy here is holding the Start Q&A folder, so I'll start him really soon. Just please, if you can make it an actual question, not a rant, rave, statement, declaration, but an actual question, that would be
Ranting
awesome.
and raving is reserved for the people in here.
Yeah, clearly. Got a guy right here with a microphone, and a guy right here with a microphone. Raise your hand and they will come over to you. Okay, over here in the middle.
Good afternoon. I'm Doug Samuelson. I work with a little consulting company here in town called Infologics. The NSA leaks has opened another area, or reopened another area of incomplete debate in American law, the right to privacy and its limits. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. In some ways, I think that conceptualizing it as a debate about privacy is not that useful, although it's the language that comes to us naturally. I think of it more in terms of we have already all given up most of our privacy. Facebook knows more about most of us than the NSA ever will. Google knows more about us than the NSA ever will. What worries me is not the sort of abstract loss of privacy of other individuals, corporations, government entities have data on us. What worries me is the potential use or misuse of that data. So I think that it's not a privacy issue. It's a what do these various actors have the ability and the incentives to do with this data, and how do we make sure that there's adequate oversight, accountability, transparency, et cetera, to make sure that it is used in the right way, whatever we collectively decide that is, and not in the wrong way. So I think that it's been interesting watching the media response, and sometimes I think I must be missing the civil liberties privacy gene, because I keep thinking, yeah, so? And I feel guilty about that. I want all my friends in the ACLU to know that I feel bad about that. But I think that there's something important there. Government can have all my data. What I'm worried about is whether they're going to mistake me for a terrorist and drag me off to jail. And as long as we have adequate safeguards in place to make sure that they don't do that, or that some individual miscreant midway through the NSA doesn't decide to blackmail me or just mess with my life or steal my identity and order 600 waffle machines in my name or whatever. I don't really care. So I think that's where we need to be focusing, that talking about it as a privacy issue is not likely to get us anywhere useful, frankly. Instead, we should really be zeroing in on what are the dangers that this data gets misused, what do we define as misuse, and how do we keep that from happening? And that, in turn, raises a lot of the same issues that we talk about, whether we're talking about drone strikes or anything else, which is, in a world where the government clearly needs to keep some secrets, how do we make sure that we have robust accountability mechanisms, even if they're after the fact, to look into mistaken abuse?
Either of you guys want to tackle that?
I completely agree. I think we really need to look at the processes that are in place to make sure things like that don't happen. And what worries me is just the temptation is going to be there. I mean, the data is just sitting there, and our ability to analyze the data is going to. So first of all, there's going to be more and more data, right? So the amount of data and what that will enable us to do as our analytic capabilities increase. This is both in the private sector and the public sector. Is just going to be phenomenal. And so to have the opportunity to learn more and more and more and not take that opportunity, I think that's going to be a challenge. And so it's not only important to define, the processes, but also I think, again, this comes back to this question of having some kind of debate. And I think it's possible to talk about these issues without getting into the classified details. I mean, we talked about nuclear strategy. Academics and think tanks helped drive nuclear strategy for decades without knowing the details of the PSYOP. So, I think it's possible to have debates about the kinds of things that can be done without going into the details. But I do think because the temptation is going to be there and the ability to learn more and more is going to be there, that I think there's a potential for a slippery slope here. So even with the best of intentions, I just think that's a concern.
Yeah. And it's going to be difficult because, unlike with nuclear stuff, we've got additional factors at play. Yep. So we've got our strategic needs, right. We've got diffuse technologies which converge and then diffuse again that we've got to keep track of. And then we've got a significant private sector business element to the whole thing. I thought it was interesting that Google, Facebook, Yahoo have all come out and said that they want permission to be able to disclose more. So it's just going to make it more complicated.
The part that concerns me, well, there's a lot of parts that concern me, and I think I must have gotten like two, that one gene you're missing, I must have gotten two of them, but is I'm worried that we're going to be in a situation a little bit like Putin's Russia, where you've already committed a crime as soon as you've stepped out of the airplane, and that it's just, given all the data that's accumulated on you, there's going to be evidence of something bad you've done, and so the ability to kind of push the button and, present the evidence for that crime is unnerving. Just to give an example, right? Or it's not a straight example, but just in terms of accumulation of data, why it's germane to the AP leak investigation, calls that were made in 2005, like when one of the reporters was stationed 3 jobs ago. That ability to kind of collect, retain, and be there forever as a kind of mark to use against you, or as evidence to weigh against you, and in a way to intimidate you, that really bothers me.
I think it should bother you, but I don't know that that's actually as new as you think it is. There was a study, and I wish I could remember the citation, but a while back of police officers and essentially any given car driving down the road, a police officer is looking to find a reason to stop, you can find one.
Right.
Because you probably have a tail light out, or you've got some little dent, or your sticker's in the wrong alignment or something or other. And I think it's always been true that if the government is absolutely determined to harass or repress you, they can find a way. This gives them yet another set of tools to use. But that's why I think the focus needs to be on what processes do we have to try to make sure that that police don't come up with fake reasons to stop you, and we have some reasonably robust ones in the law enforcement avenue. We need to make sure that we have the equivalent here, which is harder because so much is behind the classification curtain, but I don't think it's impossible. So I think that's where the focus needs to be, not on the fact that the data is out there and the government possesses it, but rather on specifically what mechanisms can we come up with to make sure it doesn't get used for repressive purposes or frankly, just plain criminal purposes.
Way in the back.
Thanks. Mark Orlowsko with the Center for Naval Analysis. Noah, you write quite a bit about autonomous weapon systems lately. And there's been a movement out by a number of NGOs to make autonomous weapon systems illegal, to regulate autonomous weapon systems. And my question really is, are we going to see autonomous weapon systems fighting the wars in the future? I mean, it would be nice if the Navy or the Army, for example, could take a vacation. We let the Chinese and American autonomous weapons go out, fight each other, and then they email us and let us know how the war went. Or are we so concerned with civilian harm from an autonomous weapon system making an error, or from an error, then how do you go and if a civilian is killed, who's liable for that? What are we going to be looking at in the future regarding these weapons?
I think that the issue isn't the technology. The technology is going to be able to do it. It's going to be a question of what's the value calculus at the time. Is it more moral, or does it align with our national interests and our values to risk the loss of American life, or to risk the loss of our values of deploying those systems? It's not something that we can that I or any one person can have a valid judgment on. It's going to be a collective decision that needs to be taken. And frankly, I don't think that the technology is the hard part. The technology is going to be able to do it.
But let's not overvalue ourselves as human beings. Human beings are really bad at most things involving humans, basically. So, 10 years ago, artificial intelligence experts were very confidently predicting that even though computers could do all kinds of cool stuff that used to be that only humans could do, that there were certain things that, by their nature, computers were never going to be able to do as well as humans. And one of those things that they identified as quintessentially requiring skills only humans had and computers would never have was driving a car. So now we have Google cars, and it turns out that not only can they drive cars as well as humans, they actually drive them a lot better than humans, because they can, unlike a human who's, we have just limited attention, and we can't watch 53 things at once and analyze it simultaneously, but a computer can. And so they're much, much better at avoiding accidents than humans are, than human drivers. And I always think that the interesting and troubling ethical question about autonomous weapons systems, people often frame it as, gosh, would it be ethical to let a machine, an autonomous machine, make decisions about who should live and who should die and how to distinguish between civilians and combatants and so forth? Well, humans have been just terrible at that. Our record, we're horrible at it. We make mistakes all the time. Despite good faith, despite every effort, et cetera. It seems to me that it could very easily turn out to be the case that computers are much better than we are at doing that. And the real ethical question would be, can we ethically and lawfully not let the autonomous machines do that when they're going to do it better than we will? Now that raises all sorts of troubling issues too, but it's not so clear to me that we humans have some unique advantage when it comes to these important moral distinctions which rely on, frankly, our brain power, which, as I said, I don't think we're terribly good at.
You want to take it?
No, your question reminded me of a really cool Star Trek episode where...
P.S. That could be the response to almost any
that's right.
question thrown out here. Let's take one more in the front.
Hi, Graham Starr, Tufts University, Science, Technology, and Strategic Affairs. So just by the nature of science technology in the 21st century, everything has become internationally focused. We're not producing things while Google and Facebook and Amazon are American companies. They're producing things with a very international focus, and even though they're based in this country, it's a lot of international cooperation. Because of this, when looking forward to the use of science technology when it comes to conflict or warfare or communication, is it worth it to focus on an American lean to it? And at the same time, why is it that these companies who are private industries in the United States able to collect information and that people sort of, I guess, bat an eyelash or turn the other cheek, but when a government, a state actor that does the exact same things, that's when it's called under scrutiny?
I'm going to take the second part first, and then I'll let you guys have the first part. I think the reason that, the two big differences, right, between the government collecting your data and a private company collecting your data is there's an inherent bargain that you make with each private company, right? I give Facebook my birthday, and in return, I get 100 birthday messages, and that feels good, right? I'm not sure why that was a laugh line, but but what's the implicit bargain you're making with the government is a little bit less clear, okay, and it's certainly less like directly transactional. And I think the thing that is freaking people out about this NSA PRISM stuff is that they feel like the terms of that bargain with Facebook have been, in some ways, overturned, right? It's like, wait a minute, I gave you my birthday so I could get birthday messages, not so I could be better tracked by a government agency. So that's my answer to the second part. Do you guys, when do you want to take the first part of the question, which on why are we making such a distinction between U.S. and non-U.S. and private company and government?
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to cyber issues, they're absolutely international. So whether you're looking at cyber crime, cyber espionage, cyber war, cyber terrorism, they're inherently international. And a company can't protect itself, a country can't protect itself without looking at what's happening, outside of its borders. So I think the issues are inherently international. Part of the challenge is that it's very, at least in the cyber side, it's very hard to deal with these problems internationally. So there's the whole law of armed conflict aspect to cyber war. But it's very hard to get countries to agree on what that means, and as Rosa pointed out, even if you get that agreement, it's not clear how that actually plays out in activity. Certainly when it comes to things like cyber crime, I mean, we've had the Budapest Convention for a long time. Very few countries have signed up to it, and the amount of cyber crime that we're dealing with has gone up dramatically, so it hasn't helped very much. Cyber espionage is all over the news, as you all know, and that's a big problem. And there's some scary things coming down the pike. So if you know about the Shamoon virus, the virus that wiped the drives of roughly 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco, that's very scary because it's the first time a virus has actually caused the destruction of data. And if, in fact, that came from Iran, and I don't know if it did, but just reading the newspaper that they said Iran was behind it, or maybe a proxy group. If you start getting groups that have the motivation to cause harm with the capability to cause harm, which is the deadly combination, there's the potential for some really serious damage. And so I think we're going to start to see more and more of that across the world. And so how we deal with that, I think, is very challenging. I don't know what the answer is, but it has to be a public-private partnership. Yeah. So just having governments talk isn't going to solve the problem. So we're focused a lot on the public-private partnership here in the U.S. So if you look at protecting our critical infrastructure and the President's executive order, I mean, this goes back to 1996 and the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. We know it's a public-private partnership, but we have to think internationally about that as well. And if you talk to any multinational that tries to operate in dozens of countries around the world, they'll tell you that it's extremely difficult for them to operate in these different countries with different rules, different privacy laws, different security mechanisms. It's a big challenge.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the theme throughout all of this for me, all of the challenges that you just talked about, the proliferation of different types of technology, it brings back, for me, the importance of strategy. We can't be deep subject matter experts on each of these things. How do we figure out the incentives? How do we figure out the governance structures? How do we shape the environment in a way that works for us? Because we're not going to be able to just apply mass to it in the way that we had. Also, to your point about America, I thought that this was like risk. The point is to have Australia, and then after that, everything's okay. But that's just me.
Australasia.
Right. Over here.
That's right. That's good.
Hi, Christine Vargas from Avison, but also a Johns Hopkins SAIS graduate. My question is, as we work to create stronger legal frameworks for our new combat technologies, will our efforts at self-regulation, per drones especially, set the tone from a strategic communications standpoint for those countries that can use drones the way we do? Or are we looking at increasing mini-crises of sovereignty in the future for criminal or insurgent pursuits?
Gosh, that's a lot in that question. So I do think that one of the biggest strategic dangers of the current U.S. drone policy, I think it's really targeted killing policy, and the legal justification that we've articulated for it, is that, as I said earlier, precisely because it becomes impossible to draw any principled lines once you're in that framework, that it we start having to rely on the good faith of government actors who say, oh, don't worry, we won't abuse this. And I actually believe them. These are people I know, and they're good people and stuff like that. And but I think that we do run the risk that, first of all, we don't know what the next administration or the one after that or the one after that or the one after that is going to be like. And we also run the risk that we have handed a sort of open-ended justification for terrible forms of repression to foreign government actors that may be a whole lot less scrupulous than any current or future US actors. And remember back in, 2006, forget the name of the guy, Litvinenko, something like that. The Russian guy was the poison sushi guy. Remember him? So the poison sushi, the radioactive sushi guy.
It's an ignominious way to end.
Ignominious way to end, being the radioactive sushi guy. Russian dissident killed in London, and almost certainly by the Russian government. And the Russian government did at least try very hard to hide their tracks. They didn't just say, yeah, that was us. It was us. It wasn't that clever with the radioactive sushi. I don't see why in the future they would bother, because and again, I don't think it's completely irrelevant whether it's a drone or radioactive sushi or any other, stabbed in the ear with a toothpick. We have now basically said, look, if you can say that a particular individual is an combatant in an armed conflict that you're in with an organization that you can't necessarily name or define, based on evidence that you can't disclose because it's secret, in a process that you can't disclose because it's also secret, et cetera, et cetera. If you can say, well, we have the legal authority to kill any person, anywhere, anytime, why would Russia next time bother to hide their tracks, as opposed to just saying, well, regrettably, this guy was an enemy combatant. We'd say, well, no, we think he was a dissident. They'd say, well, unfortunately, you don't have access to the information. We have access to you. We'd say, well, tell us what it is. And they'd say, well, unfortunately, we can't share that with you. It's classified. And we'd say, we don't have anything to say, basically. And that I do think is a real reason to be worried. This will be imitated, and it's not so much that I think it will be imitated as other nations develop drone technologies. I think it'll be imitated using old-fashioned technologies too. It's the legal justification that will be imitated, and we've seen that throughout the post 9/11 era. That when we began to detain people at Guantanamo and elsewhere, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe started rounding up journalists and saying, oh, they're enemy combatants. And when we said, oh, you really shouldn't do that, he said, well, what's the problem here with this? So I think we need to take that into account. We need to factor in that we don't exist in a vacuum. And other people listen to what they say, and they will twist it for purposes that are very, very different than we ever imagined. And I'm not totally sure that's the kind of world that we want to live in. I'm not even going to try to address the sovereignty issues, which I think are really important, but it's a sort of a whole other can of worms. So I don't know quite what we do about this. The only other thing, I think I'm talking too much here, so I'll wrap up. But the only other thing I'd say is that in some ways I actually think we're going back to the future here, that it may turn out historically that the historical blip was this moment in which we imagined that we had these nice tidy categories. We had states, these nice little boxes called states, and these nice little boxes called militaries, and these nice little boxes in which we put the civilians, and so on and so forth. And that will turn out to be the weird historical anomalous moment lasting a couple hundred years and now ending. Because for most of human history, we haven't had these neat categories. We've had a giant mess, right? And even consider an entity like the British East India Company. Was it an army? Yes. Was it a government? Yes. Was it a for-profit corporation? Yes. We didn't have any neat legal categories to put it in, and nobody particularly cared. Well, now we're in an age of human rights where we do actually care very much about developing legal norms and institutions that constrain the use of force and constrain the abuse of power, but entities don't fit into those nice categories we made anymore, which makes them pretty useless. So I don't know how we solve that problem.
Let's take one far back there. Right behind you.
Thank you. My name is Tom Scott Chironi. I'm a student at the College of William and Mary. And I wanted to ask, with all the data mining going on, what duty, if any, do both private companies and the government have to keep that data secure from foreign hackers, cyber criminals, so have you? And also, is it wise to create facilities like the one that's being built, I believe, in Utah somewhere that can hold 5 zettabytes of data, when that will present a very attractive target to people wanting to gain access to that sort of data, all concentrated in that one place, given our, frankly, abysmal record in keeping data secure from criminals and from foreign countries?
Yeah, great question. So, absolutely, one of the dangers of all this data floating around out there is exactly what you point out, is it becomes a target. And so, if you read the newspaper, large troves of credit card data are being stolen regularly, right? Because they're sitting in a big database somewhere, and someone hacks in and steals it. So it's absolutely a risk. In terms of a duty, there's a difference, I think, between the private and the public sectors there, right? So, companies have fiduciary responsibility to stakeholders, stakeholders and shareholders. So there's some responsibility there, and there's certain, Sarbanes-Oxley, there's certain things like that. But at the end of the day, it's basically a business decision. How much they're going to spend on security, what steps they're going to take on security. So different corporations make different decisions on how much they're going to spend and what they're going to do. And this is why we actually have an executive order to help protect the critical infrastructure, because the government's view is that certain infrastructure providers are not doing enough. And so they want to take some steps to incentivize these companies to take additional steps, because in their own corporate decision making, they're making decisions that are potentially leading to risks for the nation as a whole, right? So there's maybe a public good issue here. When it comes to the government has to abide by certain laws, right? So there's the Privacy Act of '74 and a whole bunch of other laws I'm sure Rosa could tell us about. And there's certain due process that I think they need to go through. But when it comes to the actual practice of securing the information, it's a challenge. Cybersecurity is very difficult. So one should just assume that eventually someone's going to get in to just about any database. Certainly anyone that's connected to the internet, but even ones that are air-gapped, we're getting enough examples now where there are ways to do that. It's much more difficult, but it's doable. So that's a risk. Whether the information is all in one place or distributed, so there's trade-offs with, I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. There's trade-offs in having all the data in one place and trying very, very hard to protect that one place, or having it be distributed and then trying to protect it in that manner. And there's pros and cons. I don't know which is better, but I want to stop there. It's
also interesting when you think about this as a public-private partnership, because the private sector actually has some pretty powerful incentives to keep people's data secure. And that, I'm not going to keep buying stuff from eBay if my data keeps floating around. So I think that they're going to continue to be motivated to improve their security, if not for noble reasons, for valid commercial ones, but also in trying to create a public-private partnership. There's actually a trust deficit between those two entities. A lot of private sector organizations don't want to share information about hacks that they've received or whatever it is, because they're concerned about what the FBI will do with that information or what might happen. So it's complicated in multiple directions.
Last question. Are we got anybody? Okay.
Yeah, go with the beard. That's what you want.
Yeah. Why is your beard so awesome?
But not as magnificent.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks, that's all it takes.
Larry Ferrero, Defense Acquisition University. I want to return quickly to the PRISM, Verizon, and trade-off with privacy question. Given the fact that the great majority of terrorism on U.S. soil has been domestic in origin, Oklahoma City, Newton, Boston, Santa Monica just this week, Fort Hood. What would you say about the U.S. government role in conducting surveilling domestic sources? Would the government, in other words, be falling down on the job if it wasn't trying to look at domestic as well as international sources of potential terror attacks?
And just, I think in that question is a second question, which is, right now there's all these rules governing what you can do to U.S. persons and what you can do to foreigners on U.S. soil. Is that distinction meaningful even anymore, given all the examples you just cited?
I think the distinction is untenable in this day and age. It's just unworkable with the best will in the world. But to me, this brings up a completely different question, which is not a question about privacy. It's not a question about technology. It's just a question about perspective and risk management. And here's what, and this is at the root of any sort of broader strategic discussion, is what should we be worried about and how much should we be worried about it? I think we continue to make a bogeyman out of terrorism in a way that is extremely dangerous. There's the whole separate question about the NSA surveillance stuff is just, do we need to do it? Is it necessary? And the statistics do suggest that barring a terrorist getting nuclear weapons or something of that nature, in the last 20 years, there has been no year except for 2001 when the number of Americans killed by terrorist attacks have exceeded the number of Americans killed by lightning strikes. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to stop it, just as we try to stop homicide. It's a tragedy, it's a crime. Under certain circumstances, I do think it can be armed conflict, but I think it should force us to be saying to ourselves, making a cost-benefit analysis of what level of resources should we be pouring into this, something that at the moment does not seem to be an existential threat, barring intelligence, which this could happen, that some non-state actor group does get weapons of mass destruction, but barring that, I don't know that we should, the Boston Marathon is a terrible, terrible tragedy, but we shut down the city of Boston and we spent billions of dollars because of essentially 2 alienated young men. And there are homicides in Boston every single day of the year. There are 16 or 17,000 Americans a year are killed in homicides, good old-fashioned criminal homicide. And we have never believed that we need to grant law enforcement authorities or the military or intelligence agencies extraordinary authorities to prevent, in order to, shoot at potential homicide suspects so they can't go out and kill again, or to surveil all Americans in order to try to make sure that none of them are planning homicides. Why do we think that we need to grant extraordinary powers in the case of domestic terrorism? That's not all that clear to me.
No, I don't think there's anything better that can be said than that.
Okay, Rosa Brooks declares war on lightning.
I think she wins as well.
And I think that does bring it back to the last question, right? Which is, if it's the case that we're kind of making these guys out to be 10 feet tall when they're really midgets, does it really justify the extraordinary surveillance? Does it really justify, breaking apart these rules of sovereignty with drones? Does it justify other measures that have been taken to zap computers far from our soil and inside our soil?
But I think that's right. But the question sort of comes back: what do the American people actually want? To an extent, this is demand-driven. That there are expectations for our ability to prevent attacks, regardless of their likelihood. So the client has asked for that, and they have been delivered it. They may not actually like what they've got, and it may not be fit for purpose. But this is a discussion that needs to be had. Do you like this one, or do you want something else, or a shake?
Get a shake.
It'll be a discussion that's ongoing. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.
I like that.